Silas Blackwood has lived for years inside a punishment of his own making. His house is quiet. His heart is guarded, and his hands are better with rope and wire than with tenderness. Then Eleanor Prescott arrives, a deaf woman with more courage than the whole town knows how to face. She believes Silas is avoiding her out of prejudice. But what if the man she thinks is rejecting her is actually fighting every night to become worthy of saying her name? Stay with the story, because the truth behind his silence may break your heart.
Dawn in Wyoming territory didn't arrive with a choir of birds. It came cold, it came quiet, and it came gray. Silas Blackwood was already awake. He usually was. He sat at the heavy oak table in his ranch house. A single oil lamp burned, pushing back the shadows of the large, empty room. A cup of black coffee sat beside his elbow. It was turning cold. He wasn't looking at the coffee. He was looking at his hands. They were big hands, rough, scraped by rope and stained with years of saddle leather. Good for breaking wild horses. Good for mending barbed wire fences. Terrible, it turned out, for delicate work. Silas stared at the small, worn book lying open on the table. He looked hard at the drawing on the page. Then he raised his right hand. He curled his fingers, trying to mimic the shape shown in the ink. It felt stiff, clumsy, wrong. He dropped his hand with a heavy, frustrated sigh. He rubbed his tired eyes. Then he stood up, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and walked over to the window. Out there, miles away across the frost-bitten grass, sat the town of Silver Creek. The boarding house was just a faint shadow in the valley. He stared at that shadow for a long, quiet minute. Then he turned around, went back to the table, opened the book to the first page, and started all over again. 3 weeks earlier, Eleanor Prescott had stepped off a stagecoach into a cloud of Wyoming dust. She didn't hear the horses whinny. She didn't hear the driver shouting for the hostler. She hadn't heard a single sound since she was 8 years old. A childhood fever had stolen the noise of the world, leaving behind a profound, unbroken quiet. Boston had been suffocating. People back east looked at her with wide, watery eyes. They treated her like fine china that was already cracked. They pitied her. Silver Creek was different. Out here in the West, survival was loud. And if you couldn't hear it, people figured you were a liability. Folks didn't pity her in Silver Creek. They just looked right through her. When she walked down the wooden boardwalks, she saw the shift in their eyes. A moment of confusion. Then a realization. Then a fast retreat. They didn't know how to talk to a deaf woman, so they chose not to. It was a different kind of cold. It happened on a Tuesday, inside the Silver Creek post office. Eleanor stood at the counter. The air in the small room was thick with the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco. She was trying to buy stamps. It should have been a simple thing. She had her small slate chalkboard with her. She wrote her request quickly. Her handwriting was elegant and sharp. She pushed the slate across the wooden counter. The clerk, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, sighed. She saw his chest heave with irritation. She saw his lips move slowly, over-enunciating every single syllable like she was a slow-witted child. She tapped the slate. She just needed him to read it. Read. He rolled his eyes. The bell above the door chimed. Eleanor didn't hear it, but she felt the sudden draft of crisp autumn air against her neck. She turned. Silas Blackwood filled the doorway. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered. He wore a canvas coat dusted with trail dirt. He commanded the room without making a single sound. His dark eyes swept the post office. Then they landed on Eleanor. She froze. For a split second, the world seemed to stop spinning. He looked right at her. He looked down at the slate in her hand. He looked at the clerk's annoyed, twisted face. Eleanor watched Silas's hands. His right hand twitched. His fingers curled inward, just a fraction of an inch, like he was about to reach out, or step forward, or intervene. Instead, Silas clenched his jaw. He didn't nod. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't even offer a polite smile. He turned on his heel, pushed the heavy door open, and walked right back out into the street. The clerk laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive motion of his shoulders. Eleanor stood there alone. Her cheeks burned hot with shame. The silence in her head suddenly felt terribly, unbearably heavy. That evening, Eleanor sat at the small desk in her room at Martha's boarding house. The oil lamp cast a warm golden glow over her stationery. She dipped her pen in ink. She was writing a letter to a friend back in Boston, but the words she put down felt more like a vow to herself. Her hand moved quickly across the page. She didn't mince words. She wrote exactly what she knew to be true, making sure the reality of her life was stated plainly. People strip away a disabled person's dignity in two distinct ways, she wrote. The scratch of her pen was the only movement in the quiet room. The first is through overbearing pity. That was Boston. They smother you until you forget how to breathe on your own. She paused. She stared at the black ink drying on the white paper. She thought of the broad-shouldered man in the post office doorway. She remembered the exact way he had turned his back on her. She dipped the pen again, pressing harder this time. The second way is by completely erasing their existence. Mr. Blackwood of the Grand Ranch has clearly chosen the latter. He avoids me as if silence is a contagious disease. She underlined the next sentence twice, her jaw set firm. To treat someone as invisible because you do not understand their language is not just rude. It is a profound failure of human decency. True equality means looking a person in the eye, even when the conversation is difficult. It means acknowledging their presence as an equal, not dismissing them as a problem. She folded the letter. The creases were sharp and deliberate. She thought Silas Blackwood was a coward. She thought he was a man who chose ignorance over effort. She had absolutely no idea about the small, worn book sitting open on his table. The porch roof at the town clinic was sagging. William Prescott was a fine doctor. He could set a compound fracture. He could stitch a knife wound in the dark. But he was useless with a hammer. So he asked Silas Blackwood for a favor. Silas showed up early Thursday morning. He brought his own tools. He brought his own nails. And he brought that same heavy silence. Eleanor was already sitting on the porch. The morning air was crisp, biting at her cheeks. She had a thick wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her sketchbook rested on her lap. A stick of charcoal was pinched between her fingers. She was drawing the old oak tree across the street, but her eyes kept flicking upward, up to the roof, up to the man working above her. Silas moved like a man who knew exactly what his body was built for. He pried up rotted shingles. He measured fresh cedar planks. He drove nails in with clean, rhythmic strikes. Eleanor couldn't hear the hammer. She couldn't hear the wood splitting. But she felt it. The vibrations ran down the wooden posts of the porch, right into the soles of her boots. A steady, thudding heartbeat. She noticed something else, too. Silas Blackwood was working very hard not to look at her. He stayed on the far left side of the roof. Whenever he had to climb down the ladder to fetch a new board, he kept his back turned. He looked at his boots. He looked at the sky. He looked at the dirt road. He looked everywhere but the chair where she sat. Eleanor gripped her charcoal tighter. It snapped cleanly in two. It was happening again. The erasure, the deliberate, careful avoidance. He was treating her like an obstacle, like a fragile piece of furniture left out on the porch. She wasn't going to take it. Not today. She set her sketchbook aside. She picked up her heavy oak walking stick. She leaned over and rapped the brass tip hard against the wooden porch floor. 1, 2, 3 loud strikes. Up on the roof, Silas jumped. The hammer nearly slipped from his grip. He scrambled to the edge of the roof and looked down. His chest was heaving. His dark eyes were wide, momentarily stripped of their stoic guard. Eleanor stared right back up at him. Her chin was raised. Her posture was straight. She tapped her own chest, then pointed to him, raising one eyebrow. "Do you need something?" her gesture said. Silas froze. He looked trapped, like a wild animal backed into a canyon. He needed a saw. He had left it in William's backyard shed. He needed to ask her if the shed was unlocked. He looked at her hands. He looked at her eyes. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Instead of making a simple gesture, instead of trying to mime a saw, Silas turned around. He scrambled down the ladder so fast he nearly missed a rung. Eleanor watched him. Her blood ran hot. He walked over to a pile of scrap wood. He picked up a jagged piece of cedar. He pulled a thick carpenter's pencil from his pocket. He scribbled something down, his hand moving in sharp, angry jerks. He walked over to the porch. He didn't look at her face. He just dropped the piece of wood onto her lap and stepped back, quick, like he might catch fire if he stayed too close. Eleanor looked down. Scrawled in the dust and sawdust of the wood scrap were two words: saw. Shed. That was it. Two blunt, careless words. She looked up. Silas was already walking away, heading toward the backyard. Eleanor's hands shook, not from the cold, from pure, unadulterated fury. She grabbed her slate and her chalk. She pressed down so hard the chalk screeched against the stone. When Silas came back around the corner of the clinic holding the saw, Eleanor was standing up. She stepped right into his path. She held the slate up, right in front of his chest, forcing him to stop, forcing him to look. Silas blinked. He read the words written in sharp white dust. I am deaf, Mr. Blackwood. I am not blind, and I am not dim-witted. Looking someone in the eye when you speak to them is the bare minimum of respect between two equals. To write to me like a stray dog fetching a bone is a choice. You are choosing to strip away my humanity, because you are uncomfortable with my silence. Silas stared at the slate. He read the paragraph. Then he read it again. The color drained from his weathered face. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The heavy iron saw hung loose in his grip. Before he could do anything, before he could reach for the chalk or shake his head, the front door of the clinic swung open. Martha Higgins walked out. The older woman was wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She carried a tray with 2 tin cups of cold lemonade. Martha took one look at the tension on the porch. She looked at Silas, standing there pale as a ghost. She looked at Eleanor, standing tall with her slate trembling in her hands. Martha didn't ask what was wrong. She just set the tray down on the small table. She picked up a cup and handed it to Eleanor. Eleanor took it. Out of habit, she smiled politely. Then Martha Higgins raised her free hand. She touched the tips of her fingers to her chin and moved her hand forward and down. Thank you. It was clumsy. Her fingers were stiff with arthritis, but the gesture was unmistakable. It was American Sign Language. Eleanor gasped. Her eyes widened. She stared at the innkeeper. Martha smiled warmly. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked proud. She turned her head slightly, making sure Silas was listening, making sure her voice carried across the porch. All folks are created equal, Miss Ellie, Martha said, her voice loud and clear, enunciating every word perfectly so Eleanor could read her lips. And equality isn't just an idea written on a piece of paper in Washington. It is an action. Martha planted her hands on her hips. She looked right at Silas. If your world doesn't have sound, Miss Ellie, then my world has to learn to use its hands. It isn't a favor. It isn't charity. It is the fundamental duty of basic humanity. We meet people where they are. That is how we respect their right to exist. Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked at Martha. Then, slowly, she looked back at Silas. Silas was standing completely still. The knuckles on the hand holding the saw were white. He didn't look angry. He looked devastated. He lowered his head. The brim of his hat cast a long, dark shadow over his eyes. He didn't write anything on the slate. He didn't try to mime an apology. He just turned around, walked over to the ladder, and climbed back up to the roof. Eleanor watched him go. Her anger started to curdle into something sour and hollow. She watched him pick up his hammer. He started driving nails again, but the rhythm was gone. The strikes were uneven, erratic. She sat back down. She picked up her charcoal. But she couldn't draw. She thought about what Martha had said. We meet people where they are. Silas Blackwood clearly had no intention of meeting her anywhere. He had been shamed by an older woman in an apron, and his response was to retreat back into the sky, back to his high, lonely roof. When the job was done, Silas packed his tools fast. He didn't stop for the second cup of lemonade. He didn't come to the front porch to say goodbye to William. He threw his canvas bags over his shoulder and walked away down the dirt road, his strides long and hurried. Eleanor watched him disappear around the bend. She shook her head. Good riddance, she thought. She stood up to shake the dust from her skirt. As she did, she looked down at the pile of wood scraps. The jagged piece of cedar was gone. Silas had taken the piece of wood with her angry handwriting on it. He had slipped it right into the breast pocket of his coat, pressing it over his heart before he walked away. But Eleanor didn't see that. She only saw an empty space in the dust. Before we go any further, if you're listening to Eleanor's story and wondering what Silas's hands are hiding, make sure you're subscribed. Drop a comment. Have you ever been completely misunderstood because you were trying too hard to do the right thing? I want to read every single one. 3 days passed. The air in Silver Creek grew colder, hinting at an early snow. Eleanor stayed busy. She helped William organize his medical supplies. She read thick novels by the fire in Martha's parlor. She tried very hard not to look out the window toward the sprawling acreage of the Blackwood Ranch. She didn't care about the man. She told herself that every morning. But anger is a funny thing. It burns hot, and it demands fuel. And Silas's silence was the perfect kindling. It happened on a Friday afternoon. Eleanor was at the clinic, sitting at William's front desk. She was organizing a stack of patient ledgers. The front door banged open. A young boy rushed in. It was Timmy, one of the orphan hands who worked out at the Blackwood place. He was out of breath, his face smeared with grease from a wagon wheel. He carried a heavy canvas saddlebag. Timmy dropped the bag heavily onto the wooden floorboards. He didn't realize Eleanor couldn't hear the crash, but she felt the thud. She looked up. Timmy was talking fast. Eleanor focused on his lips. "Boss left it. Porch. Fixing the roof. Doc said to bring it. Sorry." The boy didn't wait for an answer. He turned and bolted back out the door, eager to get back to whatever trouble he was causing outside. Eleanor stood up. She walked around the desk and looked down at the saddlebag. It belonged to Silas. It must have been left behind when he fled the clinic 3 days ago. She knelt down to pick it up. She intended to put it in the back room for William to handle. But as she lifted the heavy canvas, the brass buckle gave way. The flap fell open. Tools spilled out onto the floor. A hammer, a box of iron nails, a measuring string, and a book. It was a small book, bound in dark green leather. The corners were bent and worn smooth from constant handling. Eleanor reached out and picked it up. It didn't look like a ledger. It didn't look like a novel. She turned it over in her hands. There was no title on the cover. Curiosity got the better of her. She opened it to the middle. She stopped breathing. It was an instruction manual. The pages were filled with detailed line-drawn illustrations of hands. Hands forming shapes. Hands pointing fingers. Hands curling over thumbs. It was a book on American Sign Language. Eleanor sank back onto her heels. The clinic around her seemed to fade away. She stared at the pages. The margins were completely covered in dark, heavy pencil marks. Silas had written notes everywhere. Keep wrist straight. Thumb goes over, not under. Try again. Keep trying. The handwriting was brutal. It was the script of a man who fought with the pencil, pressing so hard the lead nearly tore through the thick paper. For a single, fleeting second, a spark of warmth flared in Eleanor's chest. He's learning. The thought whispered in her mind. He's learning my language. But the spark died almost immediately. It was snuffed out by a sudden rushing wave of cold, hard reality. She thought back to the post office. She thought back to the roof. She thought back to the piece of cedar wood with 2 blunt words written in the dust. If he was learning her language, why didn't he look at her? Why did he run away? The answer hit her like a physical blow. It was pity. It was the worst kind of pity. It was the pity of a wealthy, capable man who looks at a broken bird and feels a begrudging, uncomfortable duty to feed it. He wasn't learning out of respect. If he respected her, he would have stood in front of her. He would have used his clumsy hands and made mistakes and let her correct him. He was learning in secret because he viewed her as a charity project, something to be handled carefully, privately, out of sight. He was learning signs so he wouldn't have to deal with the messy, uncomfortable reality of communicating with a deaf person in the real world. He wanted to be the savior. He wanted to perfect his charity before he unveiled it. Eleanor slammed the book shut. Her hands were shaking again, but this time there was no sadness. There was only a fierce, blinding indignation. She stood up. She grabbed her slate. Just then the door to the back room opened. William stepped out, drying his hands on a towel. He saw Eleanor standing over the spilled saddlebag. He saw the green book in her hand. William stopped. His face dropped. He looked incredibly guilty. Eleanor marched right up to him. She didn't hesitate. She wrote furiously on the slate and shoved it into her brother's chest. William took the slate. He read the words. "I do not need to be anyone's charity project, Will." Eleanor had written, the letters jagged and bold. "A wealthy man secretly learning the language of a disabled woman, only to ignore her in broad daylight, proves he views it as an uncomfortable obligation." William looked up. "Ellie, wait, you don't understand." He mouthed the words, forgetting to enunciate clearly. Eleanor snatched the slate back. She wiped it clean with the heel of her hand and wrote again. "I understand perfectly. It is a patronizing act. It is not an effort toward equal communication. True equality is built on transparency. Treating my language like a secret chore he has to master in the dark is an insult to my intelligence and my dignity." William sighed. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. He looked tired. "He asked me not to tell you," William said slowly, making sure she could read his lips. "He wanted to surprise you. He wanted to be good at it first." Eleanor stared at him. She couldn't believe her own brother didn't see the problem. She wrote one last sentence on the board. "I am not a puzzle for him to solve behind closed doors. I am a woman." She dropped the chalk. It shattered on the floorboards. She threw the green book back into the canvas saddlebag. She didn't buckle it. She just grabbed the heavy leather strap and hoisted it over her shoulder. William stepped forward. "Ellie, what are you doing? Where are you going?" Eleanor didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She grabbed her walking stick. She pushed past her brother, walked out the front door, and stepped out into the cold afternoon sun. She looked down the long, dusty road that led out of town. It was a 3-mile walk to the Blackwood Ranch. The wind was picking up, threatening snow. She didn't have her heavy coat. She didn't care. She was done being erased. She was done being someone's silent, tragic obligation. Silas Blackwood wanted to learn how to talk to her? Fine. She was going to march right up to his front door, look him dead in the eye, and give him his very first lesson. And he wasn't going to like it. 3 miles. It was a long walk on a good day. Today was not a good day. The wind sweeping down from the Bighorn Mountains was sharp. It carried the bitter promise of early snow. It whipped Eleanor's skirts around her ankles. It pulled the pins from her hair. She didn't care. She just kept walking. Left foot, right foot. The heavy canvas saddlebag beat a steady, bruising rhythm against her hip. The road to the Blackwood Ranch was nothing but hard-packed dirt and crushed sagebrush. The sky above was a bruised, heavy gray. It matched the feeling in her chest. She was angry. But it wasn't a hot, reckless anger. It was a cold, sharp thing. It focused her mind. For 3 weeks, she had been a ghost in this town, and the richest man in the valley had treated her like a problem, a puzzle he could solve in the dark, without ever having to look her in the eye. She crested the final hill. The Blackwood Ranch spread out below her. It was massive. Acres of fenced pasture, a massive timber barn, a sprawling main house built of river stone and thick pine logs. It was a place built by a man who wanted to keep the world out. Eleanor walked down the slope. She didn't go to the front door. She didn't ring the bell. She bypassed the main house entirely. She walked toward the corrals. There was nobody around. The ranch hands were out riding the fence lines. The yard was empty. Then she saw him. Silas was standing near the breaking pen. He had his back to her. His heavy canvas coat hung loose on his broad shoulders. His hat was pushed back on his head. He wasn't working. He was just standing there. Eleanor stopped. She watched him. Silas raised his hands. He held them out in front of his chest. He extended his index and middle fingers, tucking the others away. He crossed one hand over the other. Then he shook his head, a sharp, violent motion. He dropped his hands. He kicked at the dirt. He looked furious, frustrated, defeated. He raised his hands and tried the motion again. His thick, calloused fingers were stiff. They didn't want to bend the right way. He was fighting his own body. Eleanor felt the heavy saddlebag slipping from her shoulder. She let it fall. It hit the dirt with a heavy thud. Silas didn't hear it over the wind. He kept practicing, staring at his own clumsy hands. Eleanor tightened her grip on her walking stick. She marched straight up behind him. When she was 10 feet away, she stopped. She raised the stick, and she brought the heavy brass tip down against the top rail of the wooden corral fence. Crack! Silas spun around. The look on his face wasn't arrogant. It wasn't cold. It was absolute, naked panic. For a split second, they just stared at each other. The wind howled between them. Then, Silas did something that made Eleanor's heart skip a strange, uneven beat. He hid his hands. He shoved them behind his back, quickly, like a little boy caught stealing sweets from the general store. His chest heaved. His dark eyes were wide and wild. He looked terrified. This was not the face of a proud savior. This was the face of a man who had been caught laid bare. Eleanor didn't soften. She stepped forward. She didn't use her slate. She raised her own hands. Her movements were sharp, precise, furious. She signed, speaking the words in her mind as her fingers cut through the cold air. "You run away." She pointed at him, then swept her hand outward. "You hide." She stepped closer. Silas backed up until his spine hit the corral fence. "Why learn my language?" she signed, pointing to her eyes, then jabbing a finger toward him. "If you are too much of a coward to look at me." Silas understood. She could tell by the way his jaw clamped shut. He recognized the signs. He swallowed hard. He brought his hands out from behind his back. They were shaking. He didn't try to sign back. He knew he couldn't. Not fast enough. Not well enough. He looked around frantically. There was a ledger book sitting on a barrel near the gate, along with a stub of a pencil. He lunged for it. He flipped the book open to a blank page. He grabbed the pencil. He leaned over the barrel and started to write. Eleanor watched his back. He was pressing so hard the lead snapped. He cursed, grabbed a pocket knife, shaved the wood back in 2 quick strokes, and kept writing. He wrote for a full minute. He didn't pause to think. The words poured out of him. When he was done, he turned around. He walked over to her. He didn't look down. He didn't look away. He looked her dead in the eye. He handed her the open ledger. Eleanor took it. The wind fluttered the pages, but she held the book steady. She looked down at the dark, jagged handwriting. She read it. "I didn't ignore you because of your deafness." She paused. She looked up at him. He stood perfectly still, watching her read. She looked back down. "I ignored you because of my own inadequacy. You are a whole, autonomous woman. You are not broken. You do not need fixing. For me to stand in front of you and use broken, clumsy, ignorant signs felt like an insult to your dignity. I am a slow learner. My hands are ruined from 30 years of rope and wire. But I wanted to be right. I wanted my hands to be worthy of your attention before I dared to meet your eyes. I did not want to disrespect you with my own ignorance." Eleanor stopped reading. The wind suddenly felt less cold. The tight, heavy knot of anger in her chest began to unravel. She read the words again. "An insult to your dignity, worthy of your attention. Did not want to disrespect you." This wasn't pity. Pity was sloppy. Pity didn't care about getting it right. Pity just wanted the credit for trying. This was something else entirely. This was a man paralyzing himself with the fear of getting it wrong. He respected her so much that the thought of presenting her with a broken version of her own language terrified him. Eleanor slowly lowered the ledger book. She looked at Silas Blackwood. He was staring at her, waiting for the verdict, expecting to be damned. Eleanor reached out. She touched his forearm. Just a brief, light tap of her fingers against the rough canvas of his coat. Silas flinched, not pulling away, but surprised by the contact. Eleanor stepped back. She handed him the ledger. She raised both of her hands. She held them up where he could see them clearly. She extended the index and middle fingers on both hands, crossing them gently. Then she pulled her hands back toward her chest, dipping them slightly in a fluid, elegant motion. She held the pose. She looked at him. Silas watched her hands. He frowned, trying to place the vocabulary. He looked at her eyes, asking the silent question. Eleanor reached for the pencil in his hand. She pulled the ledger toward her. Underneath his frantic, heavy paragraph, she wrote one single word in her elegant, looping script. Respect. She pushed the book back to him. Silas looked at the word. Then he looked at her. He slowly raised his own hands. He made the shape. He crossed his fingers. He pulled them back. He dipped them toward his chest. It was stiff. It was awkward. But he was looking right at her when he did it. Eleanor nodded. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth for the first time since she arrived in Silver Creek. She raised her hand, keeping the palm flat, and tapped her chin twice. Good. Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a month. His broad shoulders dropped. The hard, lonely lines around his eyes softened. He didn't smile. But the silence between them didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a door swinging open. Eleanor walked back to town. She left the heavy saddlebag at the ranch. She left Silas standing by the corral. The walk back felt shorter. The wind was still biting, but the fire inside her had changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. Silas was trying, truly trying. But there was still a splinter under her skin, and its name was William. She reached the clinic just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the dusty street. The front room was empty. The oil lamps were lit. William was sitting at his desk. He was staring at a blank medical chart. He looked up when the door opened. He saw her face. He saw the empty set of her hands. He swallowed hard. "Ellie," he said aloud, standing up. "Did you find him?" Eleanor didn't nod. She walked straight to his desk. She picked up the heavy slate and the white chalk. She wrote fast. "You knew." She turned the slate around. William looked at it. He ran a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. "Yes," he mouthed carefully. "I knew." Eleanor wiped the board. "For how long?" "Since you got here," William answered, making sure he faced her directly. "He came to me the second day, asked to borrow the book, asked me to show him the alphabet." Eleanor stared at her brother, her only family, the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to nurse back to health. "Why didn't you tell me?" she wrote. The chalk squeaked sharply against the stone. William stepped around the desk. He held his hands up, palms out, a placating gesture. "Ellie, listen. Silas is a hard man. He starts things, and sometimes he gets frustrated and stops. I didn't want him to get your hopes up and then quit." He paused, looking for the right words. "I wanted to protect you," he said. The words were clear on his lips. "I wanted to protect you from being disappointed again, like you were back in Boston." Eleanor froze. Protect you? It was a trap disguised as a warm blanket. It was the same trap she had lived in her entire life. She gripped the edges of the slate. Her knuckles turned white. She didn't write just a sentence this time. She wrote a manifesto. She pressed the chalk down so hard it nearly snapped in half. She filled the entire slate, edge to edge. When she was finished, she shoved the slate hard into William's chest. He had to catch it with both hands to keep it from hitting the floor. He looked down. "Read it," she gestured with a sharp flick of her wrist. William read. "Protecting a disabled person by hiding the truth is a form of stripping away their human rights." William flinched. He looked up at her, shocked by the harshness of the words, but Eleanor pointed firmly back to the board. "Keep reading. You took away my right to judge. You took away my right to be hurt. You took away my right to hope. You decided what I was capable of feeling, and you made a choice for me without my consent. Equality doesn't begin when you treat me nicely, Will. It begins when you give me full agency over my own life, regardless of the outcome. By hiding his effort, you treated me like a child who couldn't handle the truth. I am a grown woman. Do not ever manage my life in the dark again." The silence in the clinic was absolute. William stared at the white dust on the black stone. He read it twice, maybe 3 times. He slowly lowered the slate. He didn't look defensive anymore. He looked ashamed. He placed the slate gently on the desk. He looked at his sister. He didn't speak right away. He took a deep breath. "You're right," he said. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to soften it. He made sure his lips were perfectly clear. "I treated you like a patient, not like my sister, not like an equal. I'm profoundly sorry, Ellie." Eleanor watched his face. She watched his shoulders slump. She let out a long, slow breath. The tension drained out of her spine. She reached out and took his hand. She squeezed it once. Hard. Apology accepted, the squeeze meant. Don't do it again. She turned to walk back to the boarding house. She was tired. It had been a long day of breaking down walls. She wanted a hot cup of tea and a warm bed. But as she reached the clinic door, she felt the floorboards rumble. A heavy, rhythmic thud. Someone was walking up the porch steps. The front door opened before she could reach the handle. Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his heavy work coat. He had changed into a clean flannel shirt and a dark wool vest. He held his hat in his hands. He looked at William across the room. He gave a short, curt nod. Then he looked down at Eleanor. He didn't turn away. He didn't avert his eyes. He stood tall, filling the doorway, blocking out the dying purple light of the sunset. He didn't reach for a scrap of wood. He didn't look for a ledger. He handed his hat to Eleanor. She took it, surprised. Silas freed his hands. He stepped fully into the light of the clinic. He squared his shoulders. He looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. He raised his hands. They were still clumsy. The movement was slow. He had to think about every single shape. But he didn't stop, and he didn't hide. He touched his chest. He brought his hands together, pulling them apart in a tearing motion. Break. He pointed his index finger to his lips, then moved it forward. Secret. I break secret. He paused, taking a breath. The effort of translating his thoughts into motion was visible on his face. He pointed to her. You. He pressed his palms together, then opened them like a book. Read. He pointed to himself. Me. You read me. He lowered his hands. He was sweating. It was the hardest thing he had done in years. Harder than breaking a wild Mustang. Eleanor watched him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. He was giving up his pride. He was offering her the broken, messy version of himself, right here in the light. Silas took one last breath. He raised his hands for the final sentence. He pointed to her again. You. He moved his hands in a circle, bringing them down flat. Decide. He signed the word for learn, taking knowledge from a page and putting it in his head. He signed the word for stop, a sharp chop of one hand into the flat palm of the other. You decide. Learn or stop. He dropped his hands to his sides. He waited. He wasn't deciding what was best for her. He wasn't protecting her. He was handing her the reins. He was giving her complete, absolute agency over his actions. Eleanor held his hat. She looked at this big, rough man who was trying so desperately to do the right thing. She didn't need her slate. She handed him his hat back. She raised her hands. She kept it simple. She kept it clear. She pointed to him. You. She made the motion of pulling knowledge from a page into her head. Learn. She smiled. Silas let out a breath. A real, genuine smile finally cracked through the tough leather of his face. He nodded once. A promise. He put his hat back on, tipped the brim to her, and walked back out into the night. Eleanor watched him walk away. He didn't look like he was running this time. He looked like a man who finally knew exactly where he was going. The stagecoach from Cheyenne rolled into Silver Creek on a Tuesday. It brought mail, it brought supplies, and it brought Josiah Vance. Eleanor was sitting on the porch of the boarding house. She was sketching the outline of the mountains. She felt the heavy rumble of the stagecoach wheels through the wooden floorboards. She looked up. A man stepped out of the carriage. He wore a tailored wool suit, a silk cravat, polished leather boots that immediately caught the Wyoming dust. He didn't look like a rancher. He didn't look like a miner. He looked exactly like Boston. Josiah brushed a speck of dirt from his sleeve. He looked up and down the street. Then his eyes locked onto the boarding house porch. He saw her. Eleanor's charcoal stick snapped in her fingers. 2 years ago, Josiah Vance had asked her to marry him. 2 years ago, he had held her hands, looked into her eyes, and told her he loved her. Then the wedding planning started, the social events, the dinners where Eleanor sat in absolute silence while Josiah's family talked around her. One night, he had come to her house. He looked tired. He looked embarrassed. "I can't do it, Ellie," he had written on a piece of heavy parchment. "I love you, but I cannot handle the silence. I cannot spend the rest of my life translating the world for my own wife." He had left, and Eleanor had packed her bags for the West. Now, here he was, standing in the dust of Silver Creek. Josiah walked toward the porch. He put on a smile. It was a practiced, handsome smile. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked around. Martha was sweeping the walk nearby. 2 ranch hands were leaning against the hitching post. Josiah raised his hands. He made sure the people nearby were watching. He signed, "Hello, Eleanor, I miss you." His signs were smooth, fast, practiced in a mirror, but they lacked weight. They were empty gestures performed for the audience, not for her. Eleanor stood up. She brushed the charcoal dust from her skirt. She didn't sign back. She picked up her slate, walked down the steps, and thrust it toward him. "What are you doing here, Josiah?" she wrote. Josiah sighed. He put on a face of deep, patient sorrow. He took the chalk from her. "I made a mistake. I missed you. I learned the language. I am ready to take you home." Eleanor stared at the words. 2 years ago, she would have cried. She would have felt a rush of overwhelming gratitude. She would have thanked God that this handsome, perfect man had finally found it in his heart to accept her broken pieces. Today, she just felt tired. Across the street, a heavy wagon rolled past. Behind it, riding a tall bay gelding, was Silas Blackwood. Silas pulled his horse to a stop. He saw Eleanor. He saw the handsome Easterner standing close to her. He saw the expensive suit. He saw the smooth, fast hand gestures. Silas looked down at his own hands, calloused, dirty, clumsy. He watched Josiah hand the slate back to Eleanor with a charming, confident smile. Silas didn't ride over. He didn't interrupt. He pulled the reins, turned his horse around, and rode back out of town. The dust settled quietly behind him. Eleanor saw him leave. A sharp pang hit her chest. She turned her attention back to Josiah. "I am not going back to Boston," she wrote. Josiah frowned. He reached out and touched her arm, an intimate, possessive gesture. Eleanor pulled away. He grabbed the chalk. "Ellie, be reasonable. You don't belong in this dirt. I have accepted your condition. I have forgiven the silence. I am offering you a real life again. Don't be stubborn. Accepted your condition. Forgiven the silence." The words burned on the slate. Eleanor looked at the man she used to love. She saw right through him. He hadn't come all this way because he respected her. He came because his conscience bothered him. He came to play the savior. She took the chalk. She didn't write. She handed the slate to Martha, who had been watching from the porch. Eleanor turned to Josiah. She stepped close to him. She forced him to look at her mouth. She forced him to read her lips. She raised her hands. Her signs were sharp, fierce, unforgiving. "I do not need your forgiveness." Josiah blinked, struggling to keep up with the force of her hands. "I am not a broken house that needs your generous accommodation," she signed. "I do not want a love built on a foundation of pity." She paused. She made sure his eyes were locked on hers. She needed him to understand this next part clearly. Not just the signs, the meaning. "You think you are saving me. You think learning a few hand gestures makes you a hero. But true love requires two people standing on absolute equal ground. It requires respect. It is not a savior compensating for a physical flaw. I do not need a man who accepts my silence as a burden. I want a man who learns my language because he values what I have to say. Josiah's handsome face fell. The charming smile vanished. He looked around. Martha was glaring at him. The ranch hands were watching. His performance had failed. "You're making a mistake," he mouthed, angrily. Eleanor pointed down the street, toward the hotel. "Leave." Josiah adjusted his coat. He looked at her one last time, shook his head in disgust, and walked away. Eleanor didn't watch him go. She turned and walked in the opposite direction. She walked out of town. She followed the wagon tracks. She found Silas a mile out. He was sitting on the top rail of a wooden fence. His horse was tied to a post nearby. He had his green book open on his lap. He was staring at it. Eleanor walked up to the fence. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face. Silas looked down. He saw her. He quickly tried to close the book, looking embarrassed. Eleanor reached out and put her hand flat on the cover, stopping him. She looked at the page. It was a list of agricultural terms: cow, horse, fence, wheat, rain. He wasn't learning poetry. He wasn't learning how to say, "I miss you," to an audience. He was learning how to tell her about his day. Eleanor looked up at him. Silas looked away. "He's a handsome man," Silas signed. The movement was slow, halting. "He speaks your language well. He fits you." Eleanor shook her head. She raised her hands. "He spoke with his hands," she signed carefully. But he didn't say anything. Silas watched her. He frowned, trying to piece the meaning together. Eleanor smiled, a real, soft smile. She tapped the green book under her hand. "Show me the sign for horse," she commanded. Silas blinked. Then, slowly, he raised his right hand. He placed his thumb against his temple. He extended his index and middle fingers, flapping them forward twice like the ears of a horse. "Like this?" he signed. "Exactly like that," she signed back. Silas let out a long breath. The tension in his shoulders melted away. He looked out over his land, then down at the woman standing in the dirt beside him. He didn't need to be a polished Eastern gentleman. He just needed to be right here. The town hall in Silver Creek was a large, drafty room above the livery stable. It smelled of hay, wet wool, and chewing tobacco. It was packed tight. Hiram Montgomery sat at the front table. He was a wealthy land speculator, a man who wore too much cologne and smiled with too many teeth. He had his eyes set on William Prescott's land. The clinic sat on a prime piece of real estate, right over a deep, clean aquifer. William was sitting beside Eleanor. He looked pale. He was still recovering from his injuries. He leaned heavily on his cane. The town council sat behind a long oak table. 5 men, stern, tired, ready to get this over with. Eleanor watched the room. She couldn't hear the murmurs. She couldn't hear the gavel bang against the wood. But she felt the vibration run up through the floorboards. The meeting had begun. Hiram Montgomery stood up. He adjusted his lapels. He turned to face the crowd, making sure his voice boomed off the rafters. Eleanor focused intensely on his lips. "Tragic situation. Dr. Prescott is unfit. Requires a capable steward for the land." Hiram was arguing that William was too sick to manage his affairs. He wanted the council to appoint a conservator, namely Hiram himself. William stood up. His hands shook. "I am perfectly capable," he said. "My sister Eleanor has been assisting me. She handles the ledgers. She manages the accounts. She can testify to the state of my affairs." Hiram smiled. It was a cold, oily smile. He turned to the council. "Gentlemen," Hiram said. He slowed his words down, making sure Eleanor caught every single one. "The law requires a competent witness, a witness who can be questioned, a witness who can speak the king's English aloud." He pointed a fat finger at Eleanor. "This woman is a deaf mute. She cannot utter a single word. How can we trust a ledger kept by someone who cannot even hear the bells of the church? How can she testify in a legal proceeding? We cannot accept scribbles on a chalkboard as binding legal testimony. She has no standing in this room. The room erupted. Men shouted. Some agreed with Hiram. Some yelled at him to sit down. Eleanor sat perfectly still. Her blood ran ice cold. It wasn't just about the land anymore. Hiram Montgomery was trying to erase her legally. He was using the law to declare her less than human. She reached for her slate, but her hands were shaking too hard. A heavy boot stepped onto the wooden platform. The crowd fell quiet. Silas Blackwood walked down the center aisle. He didn't look at Hiram. He didn't look at the council. He walked straight to Eleanor. He stood in front of her. He took his hat off. He set it on the table. He turned his back to the town council. He faced Eleanor completely. He raised his hands. "I will translate," Silas signed. The movements were deliberate. "Steady. You speak." Eleanor looked at his hands. Then she looked at his eyes. There was no pity there. There was only absolute, unwavering solidarity. She stood up. She didn't need her slate. She had a voice. And standing right in front of her was the man who was going to amplify it. Eleanor raised her hands. She began to sign. Silas watched her intently. He didn't miss a single gesture. He turned his head slightly over his shoulder, projecting his deep, gravelly voice across the silent room. He didn't paraphrase. He spoke her exact words. "A person's ability to hear or speak does not define their intellect," Silas said, his voice ringing off the timber walls. Eleanor signed faster. Her movements cut through the air with furious grace. "It does not define their character, and it absolutely does not define their legal standing." Silas's voice grew louder, matching the intensity of her hands. Hiram stepped forward, his face red. "Mr. Blackwood, you cannot possibly—" "Shut your mouth, Hiram," Silas growled, not breaking eye contact with Eleanor. "The lady has the floor." Eleanor continued. "Justice may be blind," Silas translated, his voice ringing with conviction, "but it cannot be permitted to be deaf to those who speak a different language. My silence is a condition of my body. It is not a weakness of my mind." She stepped out from behind the table. She looked directly at the 5 men sitting on the council. She signed her final sentence. She poured every ounce of her frustration, her dignity, and her humanity into the movement of her hands. Silas stood tall. He delivered the final blow. "To dismiss my testimony today is not an enforcement of the law. It is a systemic violation of my fundamental human rights. If you strip me of my voice today simply because you refuse to understand it, you are not men of justice. You are simply cowards." Eleanor dropped her hands. The silence in the room was absolute. It was thicker than any silence Eleanor had ever known. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Hiram Montgomery opened his mouth to speak. The head of the town council, an old rancher with a white beard, picked up his gavel. He didn't look at Hiram, he looked at Eleanor. He brought the gavel down. Bang! "The petition for conservatorship is denied," the old man said roughly. "Dr. Prescott retains his land, and his sister's ledgers are hereby recognized as legal record in this town." The room exhaled. People started clapping. William sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Hiram Montgomery turned pale. He grabbed his hat and practically ran for the stairs. Eleanor didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the council. She looked at Silas. He was breathing hard. Translating that fast, under that much pressure, had taken everything he had. He looked down at her. He didn't smile. He didn't expect a thank you. He had just done what needed to be done. He picked up his hat. Eleanor raised her hand. She pressed her fingertips to her chin, moving her hand down and toward him. "Thank you." Silas shook his head. He raised his own hands. "Your words," he signed slowly, pointing to her. "Not mine." He put his hat back on. He turned and walked down the aisle, the crowd parting to let him through. Eleanor watched his broad shoulders disappear down the stairs. He hadn't saved her. He hadn't fought her battle for her. He had simply handed her the sword. And she realized, right then and there in the dusty town hall, that she was entirely, hopelessly in love with him. The dust from the town hall took 2 full days to settle. When it did, the air in Silver Creek felt different, lighter. The men in town tipped their hats to Eleanor when she walked to the mercantile. They didn't look through her anymore. They looked at her. They had seen a deaf woman stand her ground against the ugliest part of the law, and they had seen the hardest man in the valley stand right beside her. On Thursday afternoon, Eleanor walked out to the Blackwood Ranch. She didn't march. She didn't carry a slate full of angry words. She just walked. The autumn air was sharp, biting at her cheeks, but the sky was a brilliant, bruised purple. She found Silas out by the far pasture. He was walking the fence line. He carried a heavy coil of barbed wire over one shoulder and a pair of iron pliers in his free hand. He saw her coming. He stopped. He dropped the wire. It hit the dirt with a heavy metallic clatter. He didn't run this time. He took off his thick leather work gloves. He tucked them into his belt. He wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. He waited for her. Eleanor stopped a few feet away. She leaned on her walking stick. She looked at the vast rolling acres of his land. Then she looked at him. She raised her hands. "Walk with me?" she signed. Silas nodded. They walked, side by side. They followed the long, winding line of cedar posts that separated the Blackwood Ranch from the wild, open prairie. They didn't talk right away. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge. After a mile, they reached a high ridge. You could see the whole valley from up there. The river cut through the yellow grass like a ribbon of cold steel. Silas stopped. He leaned his forearms against the top rail of the fence. He stared out at the water. Eleanor stood beside him. She watched his profile. He looked older today. The lines around his eyes were cut deep. He took a slow, jagged breath. Then he turned to face her. He raised his hands. They were trembling slightly. "My wife," Silas signed. He was slow. He had to think about every shape. Her name was Sarah. Eleanor stayed perfectly still. She didn't interrupt. She gave him the space to pull the words out of his chest. 5 years ago, he signed. He pointed a finger toward the mountains in the distance. "I went away. Cattle drive, 3 months on the trail." He stopped. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. It was a heavy, exhausted motion. He forced himself to raise his hands again. "Fever came to town. Fast, bad. I did not know." He crossed his arms over his chest, then opened them wide, dropping his head, the sign for gone. "I came home. She was in the ground." Silas lowered his hands. He looked at the dirt under his boots. He looked like a man waiting for a judge to pass a terrible sentence. Eleanor felt a hard, painful lump rise in her throat. She understood now. She understood the isolation, the big, empty house, the way he worked himself to the bone from sunup to sundown. He was punishing himself. Silas raised his hands one more time. The signs were sharp with self-hatred. "I was not here. I did not protect her. I chose to stay quiet. I chose to be alone. I earned the quiet." He looked at Eleanor. His dark eyes were shattered. He was offering her his deepest, ugliest wound. He was showing her exactly why he was a broken man. Eleanor didn't pity him. Pity was useless. Pity was Boston. What Silas Blackwood needed was the truth. She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small notepad and a charcoal pencil. She didn't want to sign this. She wanted the words to be permanent. She wanted him to hold them. She wrote fast. Her handwriting was bold and dark. When she was finished, she tore the page from the book. She stepped close to him. She pressed the paper flat against his chest, right over his heart, forcing him to take it. Silas took the paper. He looked down. He read the words. "Imprisoning yourself in guilt doesn't bring the dead back, Silas. It only robs you of your own life. You think your isolation is a tribute to her. It is not. The only true way to honor the departed is to live the rest of your days fully and to cherish the people standing right in front of you. Suffering is not a virtue. It is a choice. And it is time for you to choose something else. Silas stared at the paper. The wind whipped the edges of the page, but his grip was like iron. He read the words again and again. A single tear broke loose. It tracked a clean line down the dust on his weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He folded the paper slowly, carefully. He unbuttoned the top of his coat and slipped the paper into his breast pocket. He looked at Eleanor. He didn't sign "thank you." That wasn't enough. Instead, he closed the distance between them, just one step, but it felt like a mile. He reached out. His big, rough hand hovered in the air for a second. Then he gently wrapped his fingers around hers. It was their first real physical contact. His hand was warm. It was rough as sandpaper, but the touch was incredibly gentle. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked up into his eyes. Silas squeezed her hand once. With his free hand, he signed a single, clumsy sentence. "You taught me how to speak again." Eleanor smiled. The wind howled around them, but standing there on the ridge, holding the hand of a man who was finally learning how to forgive himself, the world felt perfectly, beautifully quiet. Winter did not knock on the door in Wyoming. It kicked it down. It happened exactly 1 week later. Eleanor had walked out to the Blackwood Ranch to deliver a jar of Martha's elderberry syrup. William had asked her to drop it off. The morning sky had been a pale, deceiving blue, but by noon the wind shifted. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. A wall of white clouds crested the Bighorn Mountains and slammed into the valley. Silas met her on the front porch, just as the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall. The wind was already howling, tearing the last dead leaves from the oak trees. "You can't walk back in this," Silas signed quickly. The wind was whipping his coat around his legs. "It is a whiteout. You will stay here, safe." Eleanor didn't argue. She knew Western weather. A blizzard out here could bury a man alive in 10 minutes. She nodded. Silas ushered her inside the main house. It was massive and quiet. The thick log walls completely killed the sound of the storm outside. "I have to check the barn," Silas signed. "The horses, the water troughs. I will be back. Stay by the fire." He threw a heavy buffalo hide over his shoulders and pushed back out into the storm. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him. Eleanor was alone in the house. She took off her wool coat and hung it on a peg by the door. She walked into the parlor. A fire was crackling in the massive stone hearth. The house was spotlessly clean, but it felt empty. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor. It was a house built for survival, not for living. She walked past the parlor and found a smaller room down the hall. It was a library, or a study. It smelled of old paper, leather dust, and pipe tobacco. The fire in the small cast-iron stove was burning low. The room was getting cold. Eleanor looked around for the wood box. She found it tucked in the corner, but it was empty. She knelt down on the braided rug, looking under the heavy oak desk to see if any stray logs had rolled underneath. There was no wood. But there was a box. It was a small cedar box, pushed far to the back, hidden behind a stack of old ledger books. It looked old. It looked private. Eleanor hesitated. She knew she shouldn't pry. It wasn't her house, but the box wasn't locked. The brass clasp was hanging loose. She reached out and pulled the box out from under the desk. She sat back on her heels. The wood was smooth under her fingers. She opened the lid. Inside the box, there were no letters. There were no photographs. There was only a single small notebook. It wasn't the thick green instruction manual she had seen at the clinic. That book had been printed. Official. This notebook was different. It was bound in cheap brown leather. The pages were yellowed and uneven. Eleanor picked it up. She opened the cover. On the very first page, written in Silas's sharp, heavy handwriting, was a date. September 4th. Eleanor froze. September 4th. That was 3 months ago. That was the exact week she had arrived in Silver Creek. That was the week she had gone to the post office. That was the week he had turned his back on her and walked out the door. Her heart started to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned the page. There were no vocabulary words. There were no signs for horse or fence or weather. The entire page was covered in pencil sketches, clumsy, crude drawings of a single hand, drawn over and over again from different angles. A hand with the fingers curled into a fist, the thumb resting across the top. Underneath the drawing, Silas had written a letter, E. Eleanor stopped breathing. She turned the next page. Another drawing. The index finger pointing straight up, the thumb resting flat, the letter L, page after page, drawing after drawing. EANOR. He hadn't been learning how to talk to a deaf person. He hadn't been learning generic, charitable phrases to make himself feel like a good man. He had been learning her name. Eleanor traced the heavy pencil marks with her trembling fingers. The paper was practically torn where he had pressed the pencil down too hard, fighting his own frustration. She turned to the very last page of the book. There were no drawings here, just a paragraph of text. Eleanor read it. The words blurred as tears suddenly welled in her eyes. I saw her today at the post office. She was trying to buy a simple stamp. The clerk treated her like an animal. I wanted to break his jaw. But I realized if I stepped in, I would just be another man speaking for her. I would be treating her like she couldn't fight her own battles. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand. A quiet sob shook her chest. She kept reading. I turned around and walked out. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. I know she thinks I am ignoring her. I know she thinks I am disgusted by her silence. Let her think it. I have to get this right. She deserves to be called by her name in her own language, perfectly, without hesitation, before I ever dare to look her in the eye. I will not approach her with clumsy hands. I will not disrespect her with my ignorance. I will learn her name, even if it takes me every night this winter. The notebook slipped from Eleanor's hands. It hit the floor softly. She pulled her knees to her chest. She wrapped her arms around her legs, buried her face in her knees, and wept. She wept for the weeks she had spent hating him. She wept for the anger she had carried. Most of all, she wept for the sheer, overwhelming beauty of what this man had done. During the darkest days of her life, when she felt completely erased by the world, Silas Blackwood had been sitting alone in this cold room. He had been grinding his rough, calloused hands into the late hours of the night, fighting his own stiffness, fighting his own shame, not out of pity, not out of charity, but out of a profound, earth-shattering respect for her dignity. He had refused to look at her until he was worthy of her attention. The heavy oak front door banged open. A blast of freezing wind rushed down the hallway, carrying the smell of snow and wet horses. The door slammed shut again. Heavy boots thudded against the floorboards. "Ellie?" Silas's deep voice carried down the hall. Eleanor scrambled to her feet. She wiped the tears from her face, but her hands were shaking too hard to do a good job. She picked up the small brown notebook. She held it tightly against her chest. Silas appeared in the doorway of the study. He was covered in snow. His face was red from the freezing wind. He was taking off his thick leather gloves. He saw her standing there. He saw the tears on her face. He dropped his gloves. He took a fast step forward, panic flashing in his dark eyes. "Hurt?" He signed quickly, his hands flying up. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor shook her head. She took a step toward him. She held up the small brown notebook. Silas stopped dead. He looked at the book, the color completely drained from his wind-burned face. The tough, unbreakable rancher suddenly looked terrified. He looked at her eyes. He saw the tears. He swallowed hard. His chest heaved with a ragged breath. Eleanor didn't write on her slate. She didn't use a notepad. She put the notebook down on the desk. She walked right up to him. She didn't care that his coat was covered in melting snow. She didn't care that he was freezing cold. She raised her hands. Her fingers were trembling, but her movements were clear. Perfect. You ignored me on the street, she signed, her eyes locked onto his, because you were terrified of spelling my name wrong? Silas stared at her hands. He read the question. He looked down at the floor. The big man looked completely defeated. He slowly, heavily, nodded his head. Eleanor stepped closer. She reached out. She placed her warm, soft hands over his large, cold, calloused ones. She lifted his hands. She brought them up to her chest. She looked up into his eyes, and she smiled. A brilliant, tear-stained, beautiful smile. Silas looked at her. He didn't understand. He expected anger. He expected her to call him a fool. Instead, Eleanor gently adjusted his fingers. She curled his fingers into a fist, resting the thumb across the top. E, she mouthed the letter. She moved his fingers again, the index finger up, the thumb flat. L. She held his hands there, pressed against her heart. And for the first time in his life, Silas Blackwood understood exactly what it felt like to be completely, utterly understood. The blizzard raged outside the thick log walls. The wind screamed through the valley, burying Silver Creek in a sea of white. Inside the study, the world was perfectly still. Silas looked down at his hands. Eleanor's warm, soft fingers were still resting over his knuckles. She had just guided his hands to spell the first two letters of her name. E-L, he looked up at her. His dark eyes were wide, searching her face for any trace of anger, any trace of mockery. He found none, only a soft, radiant understanding. Silas pulled his hands back, slowly, gently. He took a deep breath. His chest expanded against his heavy wool shirt. He stepped over to the desk and picked up the small brown notebook, the one filled with his clumsy, desperate sketches. He held it out. He looked at it like it was a piece of his own exposed heart. He set it down on the desk. He didn't want to hide it anymore. He raised his hands. He was still cold from the storm. His fingers were stiff. But he didn't reach for a pencil. He didn't reach for a slate. He looked Eleanor right in the eye. I was a coward, he signed. The movements were jerky but accurate. I was a proud, foolish coward. Eleanor shook her head. She raised her own hands. You were learning, she signed back. Her movements were smooth, like water flowing over river stones. Silas closed his eyes for a second. The tension in his jaw relaxed. He opened his eyes and stepped closer to her. The heat from the cast-iron stove radiated against his legs, but the real warmth was coming from the space between them. He raised his hands again. He had practiced this speech. He had practiced it in the dark, in the cold, while mending fences and breaking horses. He just never thought he would actually get to say it. I cannot bring sound to your world, Silas signed. Every gesture was deliberate, heavy with absolute sincerity. I cannot fix the silence, but I swear to make these hands instruments of your freedom. He paused. He needed to make sure she was following. She was. Her eyes were locked onto his hands, tracking every single motion. I watched men in town pity you, he continued. I watched them treat you like glass. I watched the man from Boston try to buy your gratitude. I hated all of it. He stepped even closer. Now they were inches apart. He looked down at her. Loving you isn't about sheltering a fragile bird, Silas signed. He pressed the signs hard into the air. It is about standing shoulder to shoulder with the strongest woman I have ever known. Eleanor caught her breath. No man had ever said that to her. No man had ever looked at her deafness and seen strength. They had only ever seen a deficit, a blank space they needed to fill with their own charity. Silas wasn't trying to fill a blank space. He was asking to share the room. He dropped his hands. He looked at her mouth. He looked at her eyes. You don't need a savior, Ellie, he said aloud. His deep, gravelly voice was quiet in the small room. He shaped the words perfectly with his lips so she could read them. You never did. You just needed an equal. Eleanor stared at him. A fresh tear spilled over her lashes and tracked down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't sign a response. She reached up. She placed a hand on either side of his rough, weathered face. His skin was cold from the snow, but his beard was rough and familiar against her palms. She pulled him down. Silas didn't hesitate. He wrapped his big arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, careful kiss. It wasn't the kiss of a man handling a broken thing. It was fierce. It was certain. It was the kiss of a man who had finally come home after a very, very long time in the dark. Eleanor kissed him back. The silence in her head didn't matter. The roaring wind outside didn't matter. All that mattered was the steady, thudding heartbeat she could feel vibrating against her own chest. The storm broke the next morning. The sun rose over the Bighorn Mountains, casting a blinding, brilliant light across the snow-covered valley. Silas hitched up the heavy draft horses. He drove a sleigh into town, cutting a fresh path through 3 feet of snow. Eleanor sat beside him on the wooden bench, wrapped in a thick buffalo hide. Silas held the reins in his left hand. His right hand rested on the bench, his fingers loosely intertwined with hers. When they reached the clinic, William was standing on the porch. He held a snow shovel. He looked exhausted but relieved when he saw the sleigh pull up. Eleanor climbed down. Silas helped her, his hand firm on her waist. She walked up the steps to her brother. William pulled her into a tight hug. "I was worried," he mouthed against her shoulder. "The storm was bad." Eleanor pulled back. She smiled. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her slate. She wiped it clean with her sleeve. She took a piece of chalk and wrote a single clear paragraph. She handed it to William. William read the words. His eyebrows shot up. He looked at Eleanor, then he looked past her, out to where Silas was tying off the horses. "I am not going back to Boston in the spring," Eleanor had written. "I am staying in Silver Creek. I have found a home where my deafness is a characteristic, not a defining limitation. I am not a patient here. I am a partner." William looked down at the slate again. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He didn't argue. He didn't ask if she was sure. He had learned his lesson about trying to manage his sister's life. He handed the slate back to her. He raised his hands, clumsy, awkward, but trying. "I am happy for you," William signed. Eleanor beamed. She hugged him again. She turned around. Silas was walking up the steps. He took off his hat and nodded at William. There were no grand speeches. There were no dramatic declarations in the snow. They didn't need them. The truth was already settled between them. Winter didn't last forever. It never does. But the thaw took its time. By late April, the snow had melted back into the rivers. The yellow prairie grass turned a vibrant, shocking green. The mud dried up. Silver Creek came back to life. It was the day of the spring festival. The town blocked off the main street. Martha Higgins set up long wooden tables covered in roasted meats, fresh bread, and apple pies. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a banjo. Eleanor felt the heavy, thumping rhythm of the music vibrating through the floorboards of the boardwalk. She was standing near the general store. The sun was warm on her face. She wore a light blue cotton dress, her hair pinned up neatly off her neck. Silas was standing beside her. He had traded his heavy canvas coat for a clean cotton shirt. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. A heavy wagon rattled down the street. It was a traveling salesman, a man from back east, pushing tonics and patent medicines. The salesman parked his wagon near the general store. He jumped down, tipping his bowler hat to the crowd. He was a fast talker, a hustler. He spotted Eleanor and Silas. He saw Silas's clean clothes and judged him to be a man with money. The salesman practically ran over. "Good afternoon, folks," the salesman boomed. He didn't know Eleanor was deaf. "Lovely day for a festival. Allow me to introduce myself. Bartholomew Finch, purveyor of the finest health tonics this side of the Mississippi." He thrust a brown glass bottle toward Eleanor. "For the lady. Guaranteed to clear the complexion and soothe the nerves. Only 50 cents. Eleanor looked at the man's lips. He was talking too fast. She caught lady and sense. She raised her hand. She tapped her ear, then shook her head gently. "A universal sign. I cannot hear you." Bartholomew Finch stopped. His fast-talking smile faltered. Then he did exactly what men like him always did. His face shifted into a mask of exaggerated, obnoxious pity. He leaned in close to Eleanor. He opened his mouth incredibly wide. He began to shout, over-enunciating every single syllable like he was talking to a slow toddler. "I am selling medicine," Bartholomew roared. He pointed at the bottle. He pointed at his mouth. "For your health." Eleanor sighed. She didn't flinch. She was used to fools. Bartholomew realized he wasn't getting anywhere with her. So, he did the second thing men like him always did. He ignored her completely. He turned his back to Eleanor. He looked directly at Silas. "Apologies, sir," the salesman said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, sympathetic tone. "I didn't realize the poor woman was afflicted. A heavy burden for a man to carry, I'm sure. Perhaps I can interest you in a tonic for yourself, to help with the stress of managing her." Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but she saw the man turn his back on her. She saw him look at Silas with that familiar, sickening expression of shared male pity. A year ago, Eleanor would have grabbed her slate. She would have written an angry note. Today, she just crossed her arms and waited. Silas Blackwood did not puff out his chest. He did not step forward to defend her honor. He did not punch the salesman in the jaw, even though his knuckles twitched with the urge to do so. He remembered his promise. "I will not be another man speaking for her." Silas looked at the salesman. His expression was cold, hard as Wyoming granite. Then Silas took a deliberate step backward. He moved completely out of the space between Eleanor and the salesman. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at Eleanor. A small, proud smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He raised one hand. He signed a quick, sharp phrase. "He is all yours." Eleanor smiled back. Her eyes gleamed. She uncrossed her arms. She reached out and grabbed the salesman by the shoulder. She spun him around, forcing him to face her. Bartholomew stumbled, shocked by her strength. Eleanor didn't use a slate. She didn't need one. She looked him dead in the eye. She raised her hands. Her signs were big, loud, furious. She forced him to watch her hands. She forced him to read her lips as she mouthed the words in perfect, precise English. "I am deaf, Mr. Finch," Eleanor mouthed, her eyes blazing. "I am not an idiot. I am not a burden. And I do not need your snake oil." Bartholomew stared at her. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a riverbank. Eleanor wasn't done. She pointed a finger right at his chest. "If you ever turn your back on a woman to speak to her husband about her as if she is a piece of broken furniture, I will buy every bottle of tonic on your wagon and smash them over your head. Do you understand me?" She held the man's gaze. She didn't blink. Bartholomew swallowed hard. He looked terrified. He glanced over at Silas, hoping for some help, hoping the big rancher would rein in his wild wife. Silas just leaned back on his heels. He looked at the salesman. "You heard the lady," Silas said smoothly. His voice carried over the fiddle music. "I'd suggest you move your wagon before she gets angry." Bartholomew didn't argue. He tipped his hat frantically. He practically ran back to his wagon, scrambled up onto the bench, and snapped the reins. The heavy wagon rolled away down the dusty street, heading out of Silver Creek as fast as the horses could pull it. Eleanor watched the wagon go. She dusted her hands off like she had just finished a hard day's work. She turned back to Silas. Silas stepped forward. The coldness was gone from his eyes. He looked at her with a mixture of absolute awe and deep, undeniable love. He raised his hands. "You are magnificent," he signed. Eleanor laughed. It was a silent sound, but it shook her shoulders and lit up her face. She reached out and took his hand. His rough, calloused fingers intertwined perfectly with hers. True love isn't about saving someone from the fire. It isn't about speaking for them when the world refuses to listen. True love is the hard, quiet work of learning their language. True love is standing beside them, not in front of them. It is the absolute, unshakable belief that they are powerful enough to fight their own battles. Silas Blackwood squeezed her hand. He didn't need to say another word. His hands had already said it all. And for Eleanor, that was exactly loud enough. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
Eleanor and Silas's story leaves us with a truth that reaches far beyond the dusty streets of Silver Creek. Every human being deserves to be seen, heard, and respected in the language of their own heart. Eleanor was not weak because she lived in silence. She was not broken because she could not hear the world around her. What wounded her most was not deafness, but the way people treated her because of it, some with pity, some with fear, and some by pretending she was not there at all. Through her courage, we are reminded that dignity is not something others give us. It is something already within us, something no one has the right to take away. Silas, on the other hand, teaches us that good intentions are not enough if they are hidden behind pride, fear, or silence. He did not want to disrespect Eleanor, yet his fear of making mistakes made her feel invisible. And that is one of the deepest lessons of this story. Love does not have to be perfect before it begins. Respect does not mean never stumbling. It means being willing to stand in the light, admit what we do not know, and learn with humility. Sometimes, the most meaningful words are not spoken by the mouth, but shown through effort, patience, and the courage to change. This story also reminds us that true love is never built on pity. Eleanor did not need a savior. She needed an equal. She needed someone who would not speak over her, decide for her, or protect her by hiding the truth. She needed someone willing to stand beside her, not above her. And Silas became that man when he finally understood that love is not about carrying someone as a burden, but walking with them as a partner. In a world where many people mistake control for care, this message is powerful. Real kindness must always come with respect. The bond between Eleanor and Silas shows us that communication is more than sound. It is attention. It is eye contact. It is patience. It is the willingness to enter another person's world instead of forcing them to live only in ours. When Silas learned Eleanor's language, he was not merely learning signs. He was learning how to honor her existence. And when Eleanor allowed him to try, even with clumsy hands, she showed that forgiveness can open a door where misunderstanding once built a wall. Perhaps the greatest value of this story is its reminder not to judge too quickly. Behind Silas's silence was not cruelty, but fear. Behind Eleanor's anger was not bitterness, but years of being dismissed. Everyone carries wounds we cannot see. Everyone has a story hidden beneath their actions. If we take the time to understand before we condemn, we may discover that some people are not trying to hurt us. They are simply struggling to love us the right way. So as this Western tale comes to an end, let us carry its message with us. Do not pity people when you can respect them. Do not speak for others when you can help make room for their own voice. Do not hide the truth in the name of protection. And above all, never forget that love, at its best, is not loud, proud, or perfect. Sometimes love is a pair of rough hands learning a new language by lamplight. Sometimes love is choosing to look someone in the eye and finally say, "In whatever way you can, I see you, I respect you, and I will meet you where you are."